All right, so welcome back. Make yourselves comfortable. In this recording, we're going to continue our discussion of developments in agriculture. This is all part of the Industrial Revolution. We're talking about the 18th century, 19th century. So, in the previous recording, we discussed the four field system as well as the enclosure system. Now, in this one, we are going to focus on selective breeding and new machinery. What is selective breeding? Okay, selective breeding is when you let the best of your two of the your best animals come together in order to reproduce. Okay, with the objective, of course, your objective is to make to breed better and better animals. So you have to understand this in context. Remember that thanks to the enclosure system, there was an increase in the number of livestock, in the number of cattle and sheep. So the enclosure system helped farmers keep diseases in check. So they started to have, you know, healthier crops and also at the same time more and healthier animals. Okay, so basically more efficient farming and breeding. But with regard to animals, the problem was that the size of the animals remained the same. Now, they were producing more animals, but of course they wanted to produce better animals. And mind you, um, it's good to note that before this point, cattle, for instance, cows, they were used for the most part for farming, not really for meat. Okay, although you know people probably did that, but not as often, and such a thing was not as widespread as it is now that that people breed cattle for meat, for burgers, for raw meat that you can use in stews, that you can eat as steaks, etc. So you have agriculturists, breeders. So they bring their best animals together. They also use inbreeding, so they they bred animals that were related to each other, and so they were able to produce bigger, better animals. And the idea was that they wanted to produce these animals for meat, for the consumption of human beings. So that was a rather new element there. Okay. A good example, a good modern example of Belgian breeding is the Belgian blue cow. You can Google this. There's a lot of science behind the breeding of this particular type of cow. It has a genetic defect, but scientists are able to breed more of this type of cow um, with the same genetic effect. The genetic effect is that um, its muscles, the muscles of this cow, they reproduce you know, at a higher rate. So this cow has more muscles than a normal cow. Okay. So of course nowadays the methods are modern, and there's the use of technology, and of course a lot of science goes into it. So it's worth taking a look at into the breeding of the Belgian blue cow. So that might be interesting for some of you. And then new agricultural machinery were invented. So imagine that you were a farmer, before the Industrial Revolution, before the Agricultural Revolution. The way you farmed was you began by, of course, preparing the land, and then you would scatter the seeds, okay, the seeds of any particular crop that you wanted to grow. So this old way of doing that was is called broadcasting. Basically, you just throw seeds around. So you can imagine that because you didn't really control the number of seeds that you were using. So this would lead to a lot of waste. So because this and at the same time the seeds were simply on the ground, so animals or birds could pick them up. So a lot of waste. Not all of the seeds go into the ground, so you don't always have a consistent, number of crops of for instance plants that actually grow until for instance Jethro Tull's seed drill invented in 1701. So this is a representation of that machine. Very useful. Why is that? Because then, once this was invented, farmers were able to, plant seeds in neat rows. So you can imagine this also contributed to a more efficient use of land. So because they were placed, the seeds were placed in, um, proportional distances, and then this helped the machine helped in the germination and development of the seed into a plant. Why is that? Because the machine would make furrows, and then would eventually also it drops the seeds and then would eventually cover the seeds with some soil. Okay, at the same time, because it's a machine, it allowed for a more efficient use of the seeds or distribution of the seeds. So, you know, people were able to avoid wasting seeds. What's the final result? So you have larger yields of food crops. So more food for everyone. And then you also have an invention like the mechanical reaper. So thanks to Cyrus McCormick. So before farmers, in many places in the world, people still do this, but you know, before the agricultural revolution, harvesting, collecting goods that were ready to be, somehow processed and eventually be eaten, you did that by hand. Now, McCormick invented the mechanical reaper, so this was originally intended for cutting corn. Imagine the reduction of the time that was necessary to harvest your crops. So this was definitely a big help, contributed to more efficient farming. Okay, so we've covered the four innovations now for the effects of the agricultural revolution. Many of these things are already familiar to you. So the most important thing is that more food became available for the growing population. And because people had more food, so they had a little bit more confidence and they felt encouraged to have larger families. Of course, if you have larger families, so this would contribute to an increase in the rate of the population growth. And then if you have more people, then you have more workers for the factories. At the same time, you have more efficient ways of farming. So that meant, more efficient because of new methods, new equipment. So, and the enclosure system. So you had fewer farmers, laborers, farmers, tenants. They lost their jobs. They needed to find a new way of living. They flocked to the cities. So you have an increase of population in the cities. You have more people who are able to work in factories. You have more food, so you could supply people in the cities with more food. And like we said before, though this is not necessarily directly connected to the agricultural revolution, As we said before, if you have more people, then you have, you know, a greater number of consumers who could buy your product, the product of the factories, products of the factories. Okay. I hope this is clear. In the next recording, we're moving on to developments in the textile industry.